The village lay nestled at the edge of the forest where the red earth met the vast green canopy, a place where stories lived in the air and the drums spoke louder than words. In this village was a young woman named Adissa, born with the kind of beauty that seemed to carry both blessing and curse. Her skin glowed like the wet bark of Irako trees after the rain, and her eyes, wide and dark, reflected not only her innocence but also a quiet strength she herself did not fully understand. Adissa was raised in a family of farmers, her hands hardened by the soil, her laughter carrying across the fields as she worked beside her kin. Yet beneath her ordinary life lay whispers of destiny that would soon catch up with her, pulling her into the grasp of forces she could not resist. The village itself was bound together by traditions passed down for centuries. Every moon cycle, offerings were made to the ancestors, and every season, festivals painted the dusty roads with colors of cloth, sound of drums, and the aroma of roasted yam. Yet alongside the vibrant culture lived a shadow, one tied to the chief, the man who ruled with a mixture of generosity and fear. He was powerful, wealthier than any in the surrounding lands, and no one dared disobey him. His word could make a poor man rich or strip a rich man of everything he owned. For many, the chief was a blessing, but for others he was the keeper of secrets that none dared to question aloud. Adissa's fate was sealed one evening when the chief's messengers came riding into the village on horses adorned with beads and cowrie shells. The ground shook as they arrived, their presence silencing laughter and songs. Every man and woman knew that when the chief's men came, they did not come to ask, they came to take. Adissa's father trembled as the tallest messenger, his chest broad and scarred from past battles, declared that the chief had seen the young woman during the harvest festival and desired her for his wife. The words were spoken like a decree from the gods, final and unquestionable. Adissa's mother wept quietly, clutching her daughter to her chest, but she knew resistance meant doom for the entire family. To deny the chief anything was to invite his wrath, and no one in the region survived his displeasure. The decision was not theirs to make. Adissa was given, her future traded for the safety of her kin. The villagers murmured in sympathy, but no one spoke out. They only watched, some with pity, others with relief that it was not their daughters being chosen. It was an old fear that had grown roots in the hearts of the people. Every few years, a young bride was taken to the chief, her family honored with gifts, her name sung during the ceremonies, and yet, whispers said those brides rarely lasted long. Some claimed they died of sickness, others said they ran away, but the truth was never told. Those who asked too many questions were silenced, either by shame or by something darker that haunted the land. On the night before Adissa was to leave, the women of the village gathered around her, braiding her hair with beads that clinked like tiny chimes in the firelight. They painted her skin with patterns of white clay, marking her as a bride of honor. Their voices rose in song, a mixture of joy and sorrow, praising her beauty while hiding the unease they carried in their hearts. Her mother's hands trembled as she tied the final piece of cloth around Adissa's waist, whispering prayers that the ancestors would shield her child from harm. Adissa, though filled with fear, stood tall, her silence a mask for the storm within. The following morning she was paraded before the village, adorned in a wrapper of deep indigo, golden anklets gleaming against her skin. The chief's men waited, their eyes sharp and calculating, ensuring no one interfered. The elders lifted their staffs in a symbolic gesture of blessing, but behind their solemn faces, their eyes avoided hers. They knew more than they would ever confess. They had seen brides leave before and never return the same. Their silence was heavy, a silence that stretched across generations like a curse. As Adissa stepped into the palanquin prepared for her journey, the villagers clapped and sang, voices strained as if each word cost them breath. The rhythm of the drums echoed through the air, disguising the dread that clung to every heart. Children stared wide-eyed, clutching their mothers' skirts, while the young men watched with clenched jaws, unable to do anything but bear witness. Adissa looked back one last time at the huts, the fields, the familiar paths she had walked since childhood. Her chest ached with the weight of farewell, but she held her head high, her dignity intact. The path to the chief's compound was long, winding through forests where the air grew thick and the shadows seemed to move on their own. As the palanquin swayed, Adissa's thoughts swirled between fear and hope. Perhaps the chief would treat her with kindness, perhaps the stories were exaggerated, perhaps she would survive what so many before her had not. Yet deep inside she felt the pull of something unseen, a current dragging her toward a fate her spirit already recognized. By the time they reached the compound gates, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in crimson streaks that bled into the horizon. The walls loomed high, carved with symbols older than memory, and guards stood like statues, their spears glinting in the dying light. The air was colder there, heavier, as if the land itself mourned for those who entered. Adissa swallowed hard, her fingers tightening on the edge of the palanquin as the drums inside the compound thundered in welcome. She was no longer a daughter of her village, she was the bride of the chief, bound to him by tradition, fear, and something far darker that waited to reveal itself. The compound was unlike anything Adissa had ever seen. Its wide courtyard stretched like endless plains, flanked by huts and halls larger than entire clusters of her village homes. Carvings of spirits and beasts adorned the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her every step. At the very center of this grandeur sat the chief, a figure who commanded the attention of all, not only because of his position but because of the aura that clung to him like a second skin. When Adissa was led before him, her breath caught, for he was unlike any man she had ever known. He was tall, his shoulders broad and draped in fine cloth dyed in hues of crimson and gold, colors that seemed to drink in the fading light of the setting sun. Around his neck hung necklaces of ivory and cowries, each piece carved with symbols that spoke of wealth and power. His face was smooth, unlined despite his age, and his eyes, dark, deep, and unsettlingly sharp, seemed to pierce through the surface of whoever dared to meet them. His voice, when he greeted her, was deep and melodic, carrying warmth and command at once. To anyone listening, it was the voice of a leader, a protector. Yet as Adissa bowed before him, a chill crawled down her spine, for there was something in his gaze that lingered too long, something that felt like hunger disguised as affection. The villagers who lived within the chief's compound adored him outwardly, praising his wisdom, recounting his generosity, and singing songs of his victories in battles past. They bowed low when he walked by, their voices rising in chants of honor. He had fed the hungry during the drought, they said. He had led warriors to protect them from raiders. He had brought prosperity through trade. But beneath these praises lived another layer, a silence heavy with unease. For while the villagers admired him, they also feared him. None spoke openly of their dread, but it hung in the air like the scent of smoke after a fire, faint but unshakable. Adissa watched the way the people looked at him, their smiles too stiff, their laughter too quick to fade when his gaze swept across them. Children hid behind their mothers when he approached, peeking out only when he turned away. Warriors saluted him with pride, but their eyes never lingered long, as if afraid of seeing too much. Even the elders, who in her village were men of unshakable confidence, bent lower before the chief than they ever would before another man. Respect, yes, but also something else, a submission rooted in fear. The chief carried himself with the grace of a lion prowling its territory. Every step was deliberate, his movements smooth, his posture unyielding. His charm was undeniable. When he smiled, it was as though the sun had broken through the clouds, and people melted beneath the warmth of that expression. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy, and even the most skeptical found themselves nodding in agreement. He laughed rarely, but when he did, the sound rolled like thunder, filling the compound with energy. Yet to Adissa, each smile seemed too perfect, each word too carefully measured, as if rehearsed to hide something else, something far older than the man who stood before her. At night, as she lay in her new chambers, she could hear the echoes of his voice traveling across the compound as he addressed his council or gave commands to his guards. There was a rhythm to his words that reminded her of ancient chants, like the ones her grandmother whispered by the fire when telling tales of the spirits. Sometimes she thought she heard tones that were not human at all, low murmurs beneath his voice, like something speaking through him or with him. When she asked one of the maidservants about it, the woman quickly shook her head and told her to forget what she had heard. "It is not for us to question," the servant said, bowing her head so low Adissa could barely hear her. The compound itself mirrored his presence, beautiful yet unsettling. Golden lamps lit the paths, but shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. Statues of warriors stood tall in the courtyards, but their faces looked almost alive when caught in the corner of one's eye. The air felt heavy after sunset, and the silence was not peaceful but thick, as if the earth itself held its breath. Adissa could not shake the feeling that the chief's very existence altered the atmosphere around him, bending reality in ways that human men could not. Despite her fear, she could not deny the pull he exerted. When he looked at her, she felt both exposed and enthralled. He spoke to her with a gentleness that seemed genuine, asking about her family, her childhood, her favorite songs. He laughed softly when she blushed, and when he touched her hand, it was with the lightness of a feather. It was almost enough to make her believe the warnings whispered in her village had been nothing but superstition. Almost. But then she would notice how his shadow stretched unnaturally across the wall, even when the lamps flickered low. or how his eyes sometimes gleamed with a light that came from no flame, or how his presence made the animals restless, dogs whining at the edge of the compound, birds falling silent when he entered the courtyard. The villagers noticed these things too, but they buried them beneath layers of tradition and loyalty. "The chief is a man touched by the spirits," they said, their voices hushed. "He walks between worlds." Some called it a blessing, others a curse, but none dared to dig deeper. To question him was to invite ruin, and so they praised him louder, sang his name more sweetly, and bowed lower with every passing day. But their eyes betrayed them, and in those fleeting glances Adissa saw the truth. Their chief was no ordinary man, and whatever dwelled within his regal form was something they feared too much to name. In the days that followed, Adissa tried to quiet her suspicions, telling herself that fear was natural in a strange place. Yet deep within, a small voice kept whispering that the chief's charm was not meant to comfort but to disguise, that behind his beauty lay a darkness waiting to be unveiled. Each time she met his eyes, she wondered not who he was, but what he was. The first week in the compound passed like a dream painted in gold and shadow. Adissa was given new garments, fed meals richer than anything she had ever tasted, and attended by servants who moved quietly and avoided her gaze. Yet beneath the splendor, unease lingered like a shadow she could not shake. At night, when the wind shifted and the compound grew still, she often caught whispers carried through the corridors, whispers that did not belong to the servants or the guards. They were low, hushed voices, old voices, voices that seemed to carry the weight of memories too dangerous to speak aloud. One evening, as she walked through the courtyard to fetch water, she heard the elders gathered beneath the great baobab tree that stood within the compound walls. The tree's trunk was broad and ancient, its branches stretching like the arms of a guardian that had watched countless generations pass. The elders sat in its shadow, their voices weaving together like threads of a tapestry. Adissa kept to the path, but their words reached her, carried on the cool night air. "She is young just as the others were," one elder murmured, his tone heavy with sorrow. "She is strong, but strength does not matter when the night of truth comes," another replied, his voice cracked like dry leaves. "The villagers believe she has been honored. They do not know, or perhaps they choose not to remember." A silence followed, so deep Adissa thought they had finished, until a third voice, trembling, whispered, "I still hear them in my dreams. The cries of those who came before. Their names fade, but their voices do not." Adissa froze, her hands tightening around the clay pot she carried. She dared not step closer, but her heart hammered with curiosity and dread. Brides before her, what had happened to them? She wanted to ask, to demand answers, but the heaviness of the words made her hesitate. She walked more slowly, hoping the elders would reveal more. "Do not speak so loudly," the first elder cautioned, his tone sharp. "Walls have ears here. Shadows carry secrets, and not all who listen are human." Another muttered, "We should not even speak at all. The chief's spirit is old, older than this land. It is not for us to question his hunger." The pot nearly slipped from Adissa's grasp. Hunger. The word struck her like a spear. She wanted to run to them, to fall at their feet and beg for the truth, but fear rooted her to the ground. Instead, she finished her walk, though her mind clung to every word she had overheard. That night, when she returned to her chamber, she could not sleep. She turned on her mat, replaying the whispers again and again. She thought of her village, of her mother's trembling hands as she tied the wedding cloth around her waist, of her father's silent tears when he turned away. Did they know? Did the whole village suspect but remain silent out of fear? Her chest tightened and tears pricked her eyes, but she forced them back. Crying would not help her now. She needed answers. The next day she found an excuse to pass near the baobab tree again, hoping to hear more. The elders were there, their wrinkled faces grave, their eyes darting about like hunted animals. Summoning courage, she stepped closer and bowed respectfully. "Great fathers," she began softly, "I could not help but overhear your words last night. You spoke of brides who came before me. What became of them?" The silence that followed was suffocating. The elders looked at one another, their lips pressed tight, their eyes filled with something that looked like both pity and warning. At last, the oldest among them shook his head. "Child, you must not ask such things. For your own sake, do not let your tongue shape those questions again." "But," she started, her voice trembling. "Hush," another elder interrupted sharply, his tone almost fearful. "Do you not know where you stand? The chief is not like other men. He hears more than you think. Even the trees here bend to his will. To speak of such matters is to invite his gaze." Adissa's mouth went dry. She wanted to demand the truth, to shout until they were forced to answer, but the weight of their fear pressed down on her. It was not the fear of disobedience but of something far darker. Their faces told her everything she needed to know. The brides before her had not vanished by chance, and the elders carried the memory of it like a curse carved into their souls. She bowed her head, forcing herself to murmur thanks, though her chest burned with frustration. As she turned away, she caught the faintest whisper, one elder leaning close to another, thinking she was too far to hear. She will learn soon enough. The third night comes for all of them. The words pierced her like an arrow. Adissa walked back to her chamber, each step heavier than the last. Her hands shook as she closed the door behind her, her breath quick and shallow. The third night, what did it mean? What was waiting for her? She lay awake until dawn, the whispers of the elders echoing in her ears, mingling with the silence of the compound, a silence that now felt like the calm before a storm she could not yet see. The sun dipped low on the horizon, spilling streaks of crimson and gold across the sky as the compound prepared for the celebration. Drums thundered in the courtyards, their beats weaving through the air like the very heartbeat of the earth. Horns blared, women's voices rose in song, and the scent of roasted goat, yam and palm wine filled the atmosphere until it was heavy with anticipation. Tonight was Adissa's first night as the chief's bride, a night meant to be filled with honor, ritual and beauty. She was dressed in silks unlike anything she had ever touched, shimmering fabrics dyed in deep blues and golden threads that caught the firelight. Her hair was braided into intricate patterns, adorned with beads and cowries that clicked softly whenever she moved. Around her neck hung a necklace of ivory, and her wrists were heavy with bracelets that chimed like tiny bells. She looked like a queen, but beneath the layers of adornment she felt more like a bird trapped in a gilded cage, her wings bound by tradition and fear. The feast began as the moon climbed into the sky, round and bright, casting its pale glow over the compound. Fires blazed in great pits, their flames dancing as men slaughtered animals for sacrifice, offering the choicest parts to the ancestors before the rest was shared among the people. Women danced in circles, their skirts swirling, their voices raised in songs of blessing for the new bride. The villagers who lived within the chief's domain clapped and sang, lifting gourds of palm wine high before drinking deeply. Everywhere Adissa turned, there was celebration, faces glowing with sweat, mouths wide with laughter, bodies swaying in rhythm to the pounding drums. She was led to sit beside the chief on an elevated platform draped in fine mats and furs. From this vantage point she could see everything, the dancers twirling in the firelight, the warriors boasting of their victories, the elders chanting blessings in low, steady tones. Food was laid before her in abundance, platters of steaming meat, bowls of spiced stew, calabashes of sweet drink. Yet her appetite had vanished, smothered beneath the weight of expectation pressing down on her chest. The chief sat beside her, towering and resplendent, his robes gleaming in the firelight, his ornaments glittering like stars. His face was calm, unreadable, and though he smiled often, it did not reach his eyes. When he leaned close to speak, his voice was smooth, his words practiced. "You are honored tonight, Adissa," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "The ancestors smile upon this union. Your people will be remembered for their gift." She nodded, forcing a small smile, though inside, her heart was restless. His words were kind, his manner almost tender, yet something about him felt distant, as though he stood behind a veil she could not pierce. He did not drink deeply, nor eat much, though platters of food were placed before him. Instead he watched the dancers, the warriors, the elders, and most of all he watched her. His gaze lingered, steady and unblinking, as if memorizing every line of her face. It was not the gaze of a man looking at his bride with affection. It was something else, something colder, though it was wrapped in warmth and sweetness like honey concealing poison. The people rejoiced louder as the night deepened, their joy masking the undercurrent of unease that tugged at Adissa's spirit. She caught glimpses of it in the way some of the older women's smiles faltered when they looked at her, or how the elders' chants were too grave for a night that was supposed to be about celebration. They sang, they danced, they blessed, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They knew something she did not. When the time came for the final rituals, Adissa was led to the center of the courtyard. A circle was drawn around her with white chalk, and the elders sprinkled palm wine onto the ground, invoking the ancestors to bless her womb and her union. The drums slowed, their rhythm deepening, steady as a heartbeat. The chief stepped forward, taking her hand in his grip strong but not unkind. He spoke words of vow, his tone low, commanding, almost reverent, but even as he said them, Adissa felt as though he were speaking not to her but to something beyond. The crowd erupted in cheers when the ritual ended, voices rising to the night sky. Adissa was guided back to the platform and gifts were laid at her feet: cloth, beads, livestock, gourds of oil. She smiled because she was expected to, bowed her head because it was required, and allowed herself to be celebrated because resistance would have been useless. Yet inside she felt the tightening of chains, invisible but unbreakable. When the feast waned and the fires burned low, she was led to her chamber, the chief walking beside her in silence. The air was thick, her heart pounding with dread she could not name. Inside the chamber the lamps flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The chief removed his ornaments with calm precision, setting each piece aside carefully, almost ritualistically. Then he turned to her, his eyes softer now, his tone gentle. He spoke of her beauty, of the honor she carried, of how she must rest, for tomorrow more rituals awaited. He touched her cheek lightly, almost tenderly, before lying down beside her. Oddly, he did not reach for her as she had feared, nor did he press himself upon her. Instead he lay still, his breathing deep and steady as though he were a man with no desires. Adissa, though relieved, found it strange. His gentleness felt less like restraint and more like waiting. Waiting for something she could not yet see. As she closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her into restless sleep, she thought of the villagers' silence, of the elders' whispers, of the strange distance in the chief's touch. She felt honored by the celebration, yes, but also trapped, caught in a story she did not understand. And in the quiet of that first night, with the chief beside her, she could not shake the feeling that the real story had yet to begin. The second night arrived with a heaviness that settled over the bride like a cloak she could not shake off. From the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with strokes of deep crimson and indigo, the air in the village seemed charged with something unspoken. The day had passed in a blur of preparations, laughter, and chatter from the women who helped her bathe and dress. Yet beneath their painted smiles and rhythmic songs, she noticed their eyes lingered too long on her, their words faltering into uneasy silences. It was as though they wanted to say something, to warn her perhaps, but instead swallowed their voices as if bound by an invisible hand. By the time the drums began to beat, announcing the chief's arrival, the bride's skin prickled with a sense of dread she could neither name nor deny. The chief entered her hut with his commanding presence, tall, adorned in robes of deep red and gold, his staff glimmering faintly in the lamplight. He smiled, that same enigmatic smile that both charmed and unnerved, but tonight something in his eyes seemed different. A faint glow, so subtle it could have been a trick of the firelight, flickered in his gaze before vanishing again. The feast laid before them was magnificent, far grander than the previous night. Platters of roasted goat, bowls brimming with spiced yams, and jars of honeyed drink filled the room. Musicians played outside, their drums steady and hypnotic, yet the rhythm carried an undertone that tugged uneasily at the bride's chest. She ate little, though the women urged her to enjoy, whispering of prosperity that awaited her union. Still, her appetite was clouded by an unshakable sense that she was being watched, not just by the chief, but by unseen eyes in the dark corners of the room. As the night deepened, strange sounds began to drift through the silence between the drumbeats. Low, guttural noises that seemed too heavy to belong to any human throat. At first she thought it might be drunken villagers, singing off-key or groaning in their revelry. But when she listened closely, her heart stumbled. The noises came from nearby, perhaps even from within the walls of her hut. They rose and fell in haunting rhythm, like growls muffled beneath layers of earth. The bride's gaze flicked to the chief. He seemed unfazed, sipping his drink slowly, his eyes fixed on her with a calmness that only heightened her unease. When she asked him if he heard the noises, he merely chuckled and brushed her question aside. "It is the night, my beloved," he murmured, his voice deep and velvet. "The night is full of secrets, but none that will harm you." Still the noises did not stop. They seemed to follow her ears wherever she turned, scratching faintly at the edges of her sanity. It was then she noticed something else, something so small yet so disturbing it made her breath catch. As the chief leaned toward the flame to pour more drink, his shadow on the wall stretched unnaturally long. It did not bend to his movements as it should, instead it lagged behind, twisting as though alive on its own. The bride blinked, rubbed her eyes and looked again, but the shadow returned to normal, resting faithfully at his side. She told herself it was only her imagination, her nerves playing tricks. Yet when she dared to glance again, she caught it once more, the shadow's head tilting toward her in a way the chief's body did not. Her hands trembled as she clasped her cup, trying to still the fear that clutched at her. She forced a smile when the chief's gaze lingered, hoping he could not see the dread that had begun to bloom inside her. But she knew. She knew he saw. The animals outside sensed it too. The goats bleated restlessly, tugging at their tethers. The dogs barked, then whimpered, retreating into silence as though cowed by an unseen force. Even the owls, who often called to the moon, were quiet. The air itself felt thick, heavy with an invisible presence that pressed against her skin. When the chief finally rose, his towering frame casting the hut in shadow, he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. His touch was warm, yet it burned with an intensity that sent shivers racing down her spine. "Rest now, my bride," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Tomorrow we celebrate again." He left her then, vanishing into the darkness with the same regal grace that had first captivated her. Yet once he was gone, the noises grew louder. The scratching, the guttural growls, the faint dragging of something heavy across the ground, it all filled her ears, surrounding her in the suffocating silence of the night. The bride lay on her mat, eyes wide open, staring at the flickering flame of the lamp. The shadows on the wall shifted in strange ways, bending and curling as though alive. And though she told herself she was imagining it, she could have sworn she saw the faint glow of eyes staring at her from the corner of the room, watching, waiting. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, whispering silent prayers into the darkness. But the night gave no comfort, only a chilling promise that the chief's secrets were far greater and far more dangerous than she dared to imagine. The third day dawned with skies too clear, too perfect, as though the heavens themselves conspired to mask what lurked beneath. The bride woke before the first rooster crowed, her heart pounding with an urgency she could not explain. Her dreams had been troubled, shadows creeping across her sleep, whispers curling in languages she did not understand. And when she opened her eyes, the weight of those dreams lingered, heavy as stone. She stepped outside her hut, hoping the morning air would soothe her unease. But even the village felt different. Children who normally chased each other with wild laughter sat subdued, clinging to their mothers' skirts. The elders moved about with slow, deliberate steps, their voices hushed, their faces carved with the same unreadable mask. The bride realized with a start that no one met her gaze directly anymore. Their eyes darted away when she looked at them, as though they feared what they might see if they stared too long. And yet, on the surface all seemed normal. Women pounded yam, men sharpened tools, and smoke rose steadily from cooking fires. The appearance of routine was almost convincing, but she could feel it in the way conversations cut off when she approached, in the silence that stretched too long, in the way the villagers' smiles did not reach their eyes. Something stirred beneath the surface, like the calm before a storm no one wanted to name. The bride recalled the whispers she had overheard on the second night, elders speaking of brides before her, of disappearances never explained. At the time, she had dismissed them as fear-fueled tales, old superstitions meant to frighten. But now, every word rang with new weight, and she could not stop replaying them in her mind. Past brides. Disappearances. Silence. She wanted to ask. She wanted to confront them, to demand truth from the lips of those who had lived longer and seen more. But each time she opened her mouth, her courage faltered. She remembered the sharp way one elder had silenced her before, the fear flashing in his eyes. If they knew the truth and could not speak it aloud, what power held their tongues still? What danger pressed against their throats? By midday, preparations for the evening began. This night, she was told, would be the greatest of all, the final celebration of her marriage. Drums echoed across the village as boys practiced their rhythms, and women carried baskets of fruits and meats to be cooked in great abundance. The air filled with spices and song, yet the bride felt none of the joy that such festivities should bring. Instead, her chest tightened with a dread that grew heavier with each passing hour. Every beat of the drum seemed to mimic the pounding of her own heart, each note a reminder that the third night loomed closer, that the moment of revelation, whatever it was, would soon be upon her. She tried to busy her hands, weaving a garland of flowers as the other women did, but the petals slipped through her trembling fingers. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape. Could she slip away under the cover of night? Could she vanish into the forest before anyone noticed? But even as she imagined it, she knew it was impossible. The chief's guards were everywhere, their eyes sharp, their loyalty unwavering. And beyond the village lay wild lands she had never dared to cross alone, forests thick with spirits, rivers swollen with secrets, paths only hunters knew. She was trapped. Bound by marriage, bound by expectation, bound by fear. As the sun dipped lower, she found herself wandering to the edge of the village, where the trees whispered in the wind. She pressed her palm against the bark of an old baobab, grounding herself in its strength. Her grandmother's voice rose in her memory from long before the marriage was arranged. When the spirits whisper, listen. When your blood chills heat it. The words echoed now, urgent and heavy. And her blood was cold, her heart trembling with the certainty that something unspeakable waited for her in the hours ahead. When she returned, the villagers greeted her with cheer, but it was forced, brittle like pottery ready to crack. Children were pulled away from her path, mothers avoiding her gaze, men speaking in tones too hearty to be genuine. Their play-acting only deepened her fear. It was as though they all knew what she did not, and by pretending otherwise, they condemned her to silence. As twilight approached, the chief's hut was adorned with even greater splendor. Bright cloths hung across the doorway, torches lit to blaze through the night, drums already beginning their haunting rhythms. The chief himself emerged, regal and flawless, his robes darker than the previous nights, woven with threads that shimmered like scales in the firelight. His smile stretched wide, but to the bride, it no longer seemed like kindness. It seemed like hunger. Her stomach knotted as she watched him, as the glow in his eyes flickered once again when the torchlight caught his face. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw his shadow ripple, stretching across the ground with a form that was not entirely human. But when she blinked, it was gone and he stood tall, proud, untouchable. The villagers cheered, raising cups of palm wine in his honor, their voices carrying the illusion of joy. Yet behind the noise, behind the laughter, the bride heard something else. A silence deeper than all sound, a collective holding of breath, as though the entire village waited for something terrible they could neither prevent nor stop. She forced herself to smile, to play her role, but inside she trembled. Every fiber of her being screamed that the third night was different. That it would not end like the first or the second. That something was coming, something inevitable, something monstrous. And as the drums grew louder, echoing into the night sky, she realized that no matter how much she longed to run, no matter how tightly she prayed, the third night would come. And with it, the truth the elders had buried in whispers, the truth she could no longer escape. The third night had come, cloaked in the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and smothered even the bravest heart. The drums outside beat slower now, heavier, each strike like a heartbeat pulled from the chest of the earth itself. Inside the chief's hut, the bride sat rigid, her pulse racing, her hands trembling though she clenched them tightly in her lap. The air seemed thicker than before, filled with the mingling of incense and something sharper, metallic, like the scent of blood hiding beneath sweetness. The chief entered last, and when he did, the world seemed to bow around him. His robe trailed like the skin of a great beast, shimmering black with hints of green and red beneath the firelight. His smile was wide, too wide, his teeth glinting like polished ivory. For a moment, he appeared every bit the ruler the villagers worshipped, a man of power, grace, and authority. But then his eyes caught the flames and the bride's breath hitched. They were not the eyes of a man anymore. They glowed faintly, an otherworldly gold that seemed to pierce through her skin and read the trembling of her soul. He moved closer, and the hut grew colder, shadows bending unnaturally around him. The bride's heart pounded, her grandmother's warnings screaming in her ears, her body urging her to flee though her legs refused to move. She whispered a prayer under her breath, but the words fell flat, as though even the gods had turned their faces away from this night. The chief raised his hands, palms outward as though in blessing. For an instant, silence pressed down on everything. The drums stopped, the night hushed, even the crickets held their song. And then his body began to shift. It started subtly, a ripple beneath his skin like muscles twitching out of rhythm. His shoulders rolled back, unnaturally broadening, his bones cracking loud enough to echo off the hut's walls. His spine curved with a sound like snapping branches, stretching him taller, darker, monstrous. The bride gasped, stumbling backward, but her voice caught in her throat. This was no trick of shadow. This was real. His jaw dislocated with a sickening pop, widening far beyond human limits, rows of teeth unfurling like blades in the firelight. The flesh of his face rippled, his cheekbones sharpening into cruel angles, his nose flattening until it resembled the snout of something that had never walked as a man. His eyes, those glowing orbs, burned brighter, molten gold bleeding into blood red, and with each blinkless stare, the bride felt herself shrink into nothing. His hands twisted next, fingers elongating, nails hardening into claws that scraped the earth. The robe that had looked like fine fabric moments ago now seemed to slither and writhe, merging with his skin, becoming scales, hard and glistening. They spread across his chest, his arms, his neck, until the man was gone and only the beast remained. The sound was unbearable, bones breaking, tendons tearing, skin stretching until it split and healed again. It was the sound of nature itself being defied, of something ancient forcing its way into the world through the body of a man. His chest heaved as though he carried not lungs but storms within him, each exhale a gust that rattled the hut's walls. The bride stumbled to the farthest corner, her knees weak, her hands pressed against her mouth to hold in a scream that threatened to tear from her throat. Her mind reeled, refusing to believe what her eyes insisted upon. This was her husband, the chief, the man who had smiled so gently on their first night. But no, that man had never existed. This thing before her was the truth, the form the villagers had feared yet never dared to name. She could see now why the elders' eyes had darkened, why their voices had dropped into whispers. They had seen glimpses, heard stories of what emerged when the third night came. They had sent her here not out of honor, but out of sacrifice. She was not a bride. She was an offering. The beast's mouth opened wider still, unhinging until the entire hut filled with the echo of his guttural roar. It was not the sound of a man nor even an animal. It was a sound that clawed at the fabric of reality itself, rattling the bones of anyone who heard it. It was hunger-given voice, ancient and unending. The bride pressed herself against the wall, tears streaking her face, her body shaking uncontrollably. She wanted to run, to claw her way through the thatched walls, to vanish into the night, but her body betrayed her. Her legs would not carry her. She could only watch as the chief, no, the creature, turned fully toward her, his monstrous form towering, his eyes locked onto her trembling frame. Her heart screamed in her chest, each beat so loud she feared it would draw him faster. She clutched at her chest, whispering her grandmother's prayer again and again, though it felt like nothing but air leaving her lips. For the first time in her life she knew the true weight of helplessness, not the helplessness of poverty nor of fear, but of being prey, cornered in the den of a predator that had worn the mask of a man. The creature leaned forward, its claws digging furrows into the ground, its breath a hot, fetid wind against her face. She gagged at the stench, iron, rot, and something older, something that smelled like graves opened too soon. The world tilted around her as her mind threatened to break beneath the sight of him. Reality itself seemed fragile, as though his very presence tore the veil between life and death, flesh and spirit. When he finally spoke, it was not with words but with a growl that reverberated through her bones. A sound that promised devouring, that promised the end of all she had ever known. In that moment she realized the elders had not kept their silence out of cowardice alone. They had known that no words could ever capture this horror. And as the firelight flickered across the beast's scales, illuminating the truth of her fate, the bride knew that nothing in the world would ever be the same again. The roar split the night like a crack of thunder, rolling through the village and silencing every drum, every song, every forced cheer that had been masking fear. For a moment the world itself seemed to hold its breath, and then chaos tore it apart. The monstrous chief lunged forward, his claws slicing through the air with the force of a storm. The bride barely had time to cry out before his shadow consumed her. She stumbled backward, scrambling for escape, but his claws snatched the mat she had stood upon, shredding it to ribbons as if it were paper. She screamed, a sound that pierced through the village, drawing the attention of those who had danced outside, pretending not to hear the warnings in their bones. People froze mid-step, their faces twisting with terror as the walls of the hut trembled. Then with a single swipe the beast tore through the doorway, splinters flying like arrows. He emerged into the night in his full, abominable form, towering above them all, his body no longer hiding behind the mask of humanity. His scales shimmered in the torchlight, his golden-red eyes blazing like coals pulled from the heart of the earth. For a heartbeat, there was silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the rasp of his guttural breathing. Then someone screamed and the night erupted. Villagers scattered in every direction, their cries filling the air, their feet pounding against the earth as they fled. Mothers clutched their children, men who once praised the chief now abandoned their bravado, their faces pale with horror. The drums lay overturned, the feast forgotten, the music drowned in screams. The bride ran too, her heart slamming against her ribs, her breath ragged as she fought through the panic. But behind her, the beast moved with terrifying speed. His claws slashed through the air, cutting down two men who had not moved quickly enough. Their bodies fell lifeless, torn as though they had never been whole. Blood soaked the earth, the metallic stench rising and mingling with the smoke of the torches. The bride stumbled, nearly falling, but she pressed forward, her body fueled by sheer will. She darted between huts, but the creature was always close, his shadow stretching longer, his roar shaking the ground beneath her feet. Every time she thought she had gained a moment of distance, his claws ripped through the air just behind her, close enough to feel the rush of wind against her back. And then it happened. She turned a corner, only to find herself face to face with him. His monstrous jaws opened wide, lined with teeth that glistened with hunger. She screamed once more, a sound so raw it echoed long after it was cut short. The beast's head snapped forward, and she disappeared into the cavern of his maw. Bones cracked, flesh tore, and her life ended in a heartbeat, her cries silenced as the villagers watched in frozen horror. But the beast was not sated. Her death was only the beginning. He turned on the crowd, his hunger unending, his monstrous form driving him into frenzy. He swung his claws wide, tearing through huts as if they were made of leaves, collapsing entire walls upon families hiding inside. People ran but none fast enough. His tail lashed out, striking bodies aside, crushing them into the dirt. A young boy darted across the clearing, his mother screaming for him, but before she could reach him, the beast's massive foot came down. The earth shuddered and the child was no more. The mother's wail cut the night in two, but she too fell when the beast's claws raked across her chest. Panic spread like fire through dry grass. Men tried to fight, raising spears, their shouts desperate and trembling. But their weapons shattered against his scales, the wood splintering, the tips bending. The beast roared again, a sound so powerful it knocked them backward, blood spilling from their ears. Then he struck, jaws clamping down on one, crushing him whole, his body collapsing like clay between the creature's teeth. The women who had once sung songs of praise fled into the forest, their colorful dresses flashing in the moonlight as they disappeared into the trees. Children cried out, some clinging to their fathers, others stumbling alone into the night. The entire village became a storm of terror, every scream feeding the beast's hunger, every prayer falling silent beneath the sound of ripping flesh. Huts burned as torches were knocked aside, flames licking upward, casting shadows of horror across the land. The beast moved among them like a god of death, each step shaking the ground, each roar summoning silence from the living. The feast that had been prepared now lay trampled, food crushed beneath the blood-soaked earth. What had been celebration turned into carnage. The elders who had whispered warnings cowered in the shadows, their eyes wide, their mouths open in voiceless horror. They had known this night would come, but still they trembled, powerless to stop it. Some tried to flee into the dark, but the beast's senses were sharp and he hunted them too. One by one their secrets died with them, their blood mingling with the soil they had tried so hard to protect. At the center of it all, the beast raised his head to the heavens, his jaws dripping with the remnants of flesh, his roar tearing through the night sky. The stars themselves seemed to dim as though the heavens recoiled from the horror below. The village was no longer a place of life, of laughter, of tradition. It was now an altar of destruction, a place marked by screams and shadows. The bride, once the symbol of peace and unity, was gone, devoured as though she had never lived. And with her went the illusion that the chief was anything but the monster he had always been. The villagers who survived fled into the forest, carrying nothing but fear and grief. Behind them, the beast prowled among the ruins, his monstrous form glowing in the firelight, his hunger not quenched but growing. For this was not merely a night of horror, it was the beginning of something worse, something no one dared to speak of even in whispers. The sun rose reluctantly, its first rays stretching across the land as though afraid to touch the ground where the horror had unfolded. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of smoke, charred wood, and the copper tang of blood. What had once been a proud village, alive with drums, laughter, and ritual, now lay broken and quiet, a carcass of its former self. The silence was almost unbearable, pierced only by the occasional crackle of smoldering huts and the distant caw of scavenger birds circling overhead. The survivors emerged slowly, like shadows creeping from hiding places. Their eyes were hollow, their movements unsteady. Some had hidden deep within the forest, clinging to trees as they prayed through the night. Others had buried themselves under mats and baskets, desperate to vanish from the monster's gaze. Now, as the light revealed the devastation, they staggered into what remained of the village, their faces streaked with ash and tears. The ground was torn and stained. Where children had once played, claw marks gouged deep into the earth. Blood pooled in places where no one dared to step. A spear lay snapped in half, its shaft broken like the spirit of the men who had carried it. The feast had rotted in the heat of the flames, meat and fruit alike crushed into the dirt, now crawling with flies. And at the center of it all stood the remnants of the chief's hut, half destroyed, its walls clawed apart, the roof caved in. It was no longer a symbol of power but of ruin, a monument to the truth no one had wanted to face. Whispers began to ripple among the survivors, carried on trembling voices. They spoke of the chief's true nature, of the beast that had lived among them wearing human skin. Some swore they had always seen it in his eyes, a flicker too sharp, too cold, too hungry. Others confessed that the elders' warnings now made sense, that every missing bride, every unexplained silence, had been a piece of the puzzle they had ignored. The guilt pressed upon them like a weight, for had they not celebrated his power? Had they not offered their own daughters and sisters to him? But shame was quickly drowned by fear. They feared the beast would return, that his hunger had not been sated but merely delayed. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle in the grass sent them spinning. Mothers clutched the hands of their children as though letting go for even a breath would mean losing them forever. Men spoke in hushed tones of leaving the village behind, of abandoning the cursed land altogether. Yet their voices shook, for they knew that curses follow, that what has been awakened does not rest simply because the night has passed. Some elders tried to speak with authority, their voices hoarse, their hands trembling. They declared that what had happened was punishment, for pride, for silence, for forgetting the balance between man and spirit. They urged the people to cleanse the land with offerings, to appease whatever forces had allowed the monster to reign. But their words rang hollow. No offering could undo the screams that still echoed in the survivors' ears, no ritual could erase the sight of kin devoured before their eyes. The land itself seemed scarred, unwilling to forgive. Children wandered in confusion, asking questions their parents could not answer. Where is father? Why is the chief gone? Why did the gods not save us? Each question was met with silence, or worse, with tears that only deepened the children's fear. As the day stretched on, the village began to splinter. Some gathered what little they had left, pots, baskets, scraps of food, and began to walk away without looking back. Others remained rooted by grief, unwilling to abandon the graves of their kin. They sat among the ruins, staring at the broken huts as though waiting for something to change, for life to return, though deep down they knew it never would. The forest too seemed altered. The birds did not sing their usual morning songs. Even the wind seemed to move more cautiously. Animals that had once roamed freely near the village kept their distance, as though they too understood that the place had become tainted. By evening the whispers had turned into stories. Survivors spoke of the chief not as a man but as a spirit of hunger, a shapeshifter who had fooled them for generations. They told each other that he had been cursed long ago, bound to consume those closest to him, and that the villagers' silence had allowed him to endure. The bride's name was uttered with trembling voices. Some said she was brave, others said she was doomed from the start. Either way, she became part of the tale, her fate inseparable from the horror of that night. As darkness fell again, fear thickened. No one lit drums, no one sang. The fires that burned were small and scattered, casting more shadows than light. Families huddled together, eyes darting to the tree-line, waiting, listening, dreading. Every gust of wind felt like a warning, every crack of a branch like a step returning. The village was no longer alive, it was haunted. Haunted by screams that refused to fade, by shadows that clung too tightly, by the knowledge that the mask of humanity can hide monsters far older and hungrier than anyone dares to imagine. And though the beast had vanished into the night, his presence lingered. In every whisper, in every fearful glance, in every silence that stretched too long, he remained. The morning had come, but the dawn brought no comfort. Only the certainty that the village would never again know peace, that the land itself had been marked, and that those who had survived would carry the shadows of fear with them for the rest of their lives. Around flickering fires, in the hush of evenings when children lean close to their grandparents, the story of the young bride and the monstrous chief continues to find its voice. No longer is it just the tale of a girl given away in exchange for peace and favor. It has grown into a living legend, a warning stitched into the very fabric of the people's memory. Mothers whisper it to their daughters as they braid their hair, reminding them to listen to their instincts when silence feels heavier than words. Fathers tell it to their sons not as a tale of conquest or power, but as a lesson that strength without honor leads only to ruin. The elders emphasize the hidden signs, the way the animals grew restless, the way shadows danced unnaturally, the way the villagers' silence betrayed their deeper knowledge. Each retelling sharpens these details, as if to ensure that no listener ever dismisses the weight of small warnings. Over the seasons, the bride's fate is transformed into a symbol of vigilance. That no tradition, no gift, and no promise of wealth is worth ignoring the stirrings of fear in the human heart. Among the younger generations, the story takes on a different tone. To them, it is a ghost story, a chilling reminder that evil often wears the most beautiful mask. They speak of the chief's regal robes, his commanding presence, and how all of it was nothing but a cover for something ancient and ravenous. The laughter that follows their nervous exchanges is only a shield. When the fire dies low and the night stretches long, their minds replay the image of glowing eyes and a monstrous silhouette moving in secret. With time, the bride herself becomes less a victim and more a voice within the legend. Her silence, her hesitation, her quiet courage in the face of something she could not fully name, all of these qualities are remembered not as weaknesses but as reflections of the human condition. She represents every person who has ever felt trapped between duty and survival, every soul who has sensed danger but been bound by forces greater than themselves. Her memory lingers not as a faint echo but as a steady reminder that even in silence, truth breathes. And so, when disputes rise among villagers, when pride swells and whispers of greed begin to drift like smoke, the tale resurfaces. It is told as a reminder: do not surrender to arrogance, do not trade safety for favor, and do not let silence bury truth. The children repeat the final words of their elders as if they are charms. Never trust the mask that hides too much, never ignore the signs that the earth and sky reveal. Generations pass but the bride's story does not fade. It weaves itself into songs sung by wandering griots, into dances performed at festivals, into the moral lessons recited during rites of passage. Even strangers who wander into the land hear it told with grave reverence, as though it is more than a memory, as though it is a living spirit walking beside them, warning them not to repeat the mistakes of those before. And in the quiet moments, when the wind whistles strangely through the trees or when shadows stretch too long at dusk, people still pause. They look over their shoulders, remembering the chief's transformation and the devouring that followed. It is then they realize that legends are not just stories of the past, they are voices of warning that echo forward, protecting those wise enough to listen. Thus, the tale of the gifted bride becomes eternal, not bound to the night of horror alone, but to the countless nights that follow, reminding every ear that hears it: beware of silence, beware of masks, and beware of the evils that feast on fear.